wanted to tap back into the energy of these two guys that both have some kind of interest in you, because I still feel like there's one person here who has a much easier, more practical way of actually being with you. And then there's this other person who is kind of like, he knows he probably shouldn't go there, but I don't know. I feel like he's getting closer and closer to just not caring about that anymore. And I want to get the energy first on the person who has the more obvious path toward you, because I feel like understanding him is going to explain why this second person is even considering breaking bro code in the first place. Okay, Four of Wands upright. Interesting. The Four of Wands upright is obviously very much like relationship energy, dating energy, someone actually seeing something that could become stable, something that could become like an actual relationship and not just attraction. And I feel like this first person does see you that way. Like, I don't think there's really a question of whether or not he wants you. I think the problem is more that he feels almost too comfortable with the idea that you're going to still be there. Do you know what I mean? It's like he already sees the potential. So in his head, he's almost treating the potential like it's already secured. And that's weird because the Four of Wands is such a positive card. But in this context, I feel like it can almost show someone who's sitting in this fantasy of what something could be, instead of actually doing something to make it happen. Like he's thinking, yeah, I could date her. Yeah, I could see this working. Yeah, I could see bringing her around my friends or having her be part of my life. But he's not necessarily thinking, I need to do this now. And that's where I feel like the issue starts. Because there is another person connected to this somehow. Friend, co-worker, mutual friend. Maybe even someone who just knows that this first guy likes you. And I feel like he has been trying to respect that. But the longer this first person sits there doing nothing, the more the second person is starting to think, okay, but how long am I actually supposed to stay out of this? And that's what I want to look at next. Because I don't think the person considering breaking bro code started out wanting to do that. I think something is making it harder for him to keep holding himself back. And Seven of Pentacles upright. Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. Because the Seven of Pentacles is someone who has been waiting. It's someone who has already invested energy into something, or at least emotionally invested in the possibility of something. And they're sitting there asking themselves, how much longer am I supposed to wait before I know where this is actually going? And I feel like that's this second person. Which is interesting, because I don't necessarily think you would know that he's been waiting. I think he's been very intentional about keeping this contained. Like if he knew this first guy was interested in you, I could see him deciding pretty early on, okay, I'm not touching that. Not because he wasn't attracted to you, but because there was already this understanding that somebody else wanted you, and he didn't want to create an issue. But the Seven of Pentacles is making me feel like this has gone on longer than he expected. Because I think when he originally backed off, he assumed the first person was eventually going to do something. He probably thought, fine, let him have his opportunity. And then he waited, and watched, and waited some more. And meanwhile, this first person is sitting in that Four of Wands energy, where he can imagine the relationship, imagine having you, imagine everything working out, without necessarily creating any urgency around actually making it happen. And I think the second person is starting to get frustrated with that. Not even necessarily angry. It's more like, why am I treating this like she's already taken when she's not? Do you know what I mean? Because there's a difference between respecting somebody's relationship and staying away from a person indefinitely, because your friend might eventually decide to pursue them. And I feel like he's beginning to see that difference. Especially because I don't think his feelings are new. That's the other thing. The Seven of Pentacles makes me feel like this attraction has had time to grow. He may have told himself it wasn't important. He may have tried to keep you in a certain category in his head. Friend, cow worker, someone he shouldn't think about like that. Whatever it is. But I feel like the longer he's been around you, the harder that has become. And there's something else here. Because I don't think he's only questioning the first guy anymore. I think recently, he started questioning you. Like there was some interaction where your response to him was just a little different than he expected. And now, he's wondering if maybe he isn't the only one who has been trying not to go there. And I want to see what that was. Because I feel like there was something very small that made him go, wait, Queen of Swords reversed. Okay, that's interesting. Because with the Queen of Swords reversed, I don't necessarily feel like you came out and said anything to him. If anything, I feel like this was something you didn't control very well. Like maybe normally, you're pretty good at keeping your face neutral around this person. Pretty good at keeping the conversation in whatever category it's supposed to be in. But there was one moment where that slipped, and I don't even think it had to be huge. It could been eye contact that lasted a second longer than usual. It could been you laughing at something he said in a way that felt a little more personal. Maybe he said something kind of teasing, and you didn't shut it down. Maybe you remembered something he told you before, and he had this moment of realizing, oh, she actually pays attention to me. Do you know what I mean? Because the Queen of Swords reversed can be someone who usually has their guard up. And then for whatever reason, the guard isn't completely there. And I think he noticed that. Maybe you were more relaxed with him. Maybe you opened up about something unexpectedly. Maybe there was a conversation where the two of you got slightly more personal than you normally do. And afterward, I feel like he replayed it. Because this doesn't feel like someone who immediately decided, okay, she likes me. No, I think he went back and forth with himself. Like, was that actually something? Did she mean anything by that? Am I only noticing this because I want it to be true? And that almost makes it worse. Because now he's paying attention. He's trying not to. But he is. He's noticing when you look at him. He's noticing whether you seem different around him than you are around the first guy. He's noticing if you come toward him first. If you sit near him. If you keep a conversation going when you technically don't have to. And I feel like he's trying to be subtle about that because he still knows there's this other person involved. Meanwhile, the first person is still sitting in that energy of, well, I have time. And I don't know if he does. Because now I'm wondering something. Has the first guy already noticed that this second person is acting differently around you? Because if he has, then I don't think this tension is as one-sided or as hidden as you might think. And judgment reversed. Yeah, I think he has noticed. Because judgment reversed feels like someone who is aware that something is happening, but they don't really want to fully acknowledge what it means yet. Like the first person may have picked up on little things. Maybe the second guy asks about you a little too casually. Maybe your name comes up, and he suddenly gets quieter. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe he starts asking questions that technically sound normal, but there's something underneath them. Like, are you actually going to ask her out? Or, so what's happening with you two? Something like that. And I think the first person can feel that these questions aren't completely innocent anymore. But judgment reversed makes me feel like he's kind of avoiding calling it what it is. Because if he admits, okay, this guy actually likes her, then he also has to admit that he has created this situation by not doing anything. And I don't think he necessarily wants to face that part. Because there's almost this weird possessiveness here. Like he could be thinking, well, he knows I like her, okay, but you're not together. That's the problem. You can't really expect somebody to stay out of the way forever based on something you might do. And I feel like the second person is starting to think that too. Not in this aggressive way. More like he's quietly reevaluating the rule. Like, does bro code mean I can never talk to her? Does it mean I'm supposed to ignore what's happening between us because you told me you liked her 6 months ago? Whatever the timeline is. There's some kind of invisible deadline happening here. And neither one of them may have actually said that out loud. But I think they both feel it. The first guy feels like the second guy is getting a little too interested. And the second guy feels like the first person has had enough time. That's why this is getting tense. Because nobody has technically done anything wrong yet. But both of them are starting to anticipate what the other one might do. And, wait. Judgment reversed can also be something that was brought up, but not directly. Like a joke that wasn't really a joke. A comment that had another meaning underneath it. I almost feel like there has already been some kind of exchange between these two about you. Maybe very brief. Maybe indirect. But enough that both of them understood what was being said. And now I really want to know what that conversation actually sounded like. 10 of Pentacles upright. Okay, that is actually really interesting for this question. Because the 10 of Pentacles is not casual energy. This is something established, something that has a structure around it. And I almost feel like that's exactly what happened here. There was some kind of understanding between these two, where the first person made it sound like you were part of his future plans. It could have been something as simple as, yeah, I like her. Or, I'm probably going to ask her out, maybe even. I think something's going to happen between us. Something that made the second person go, okay, got it. And I think he respected that. Because if somebody you know is basically telling you, this is someone I'm serious about, you're probably not going to immediately turn around and start flirting with that person. Especially if there's already a friendship or some kind of loyalty there. But the 10 of Pentacles is also making me notice something else. This first person may have spoken about you like the outcome was already kind of decided. Like you were eventually going to fit into his life. And that goes right back to that 4 of Wands. He sees the relationship potential. He sees the future. But he might be talking about the future more than he's actually building it. And I think the second person has noticed that. Because at first, he probably believed him. Like, okay, he likes her. He's going to do something. And then enough time passes, and nothing really changes. So now the second person is starting to question whether he's actually respecting a real situation, or just respecting somebody else's claim on a possibility. And those are not the same thing. Because you're not something that can just be reserved. Do you know what I mean? The first guy saying he wants you doesn't automatically mean nobody else gets to have feelings for you forever. Especially if he's not offering you anything concrete. And I think that's where this becomes difficult for the second person morally. Because I don't feel like he wants to be the guy who betrays his friend. But I also don't think he wants to look back later and realize, I stayed away from someone I genuinely liked because another guy kept saying he was going to do something and never did. And there's another layer to that. You still get a choice. I feel like he's starting to think about that too. Like, maybe he's asking himself, why are we acting like this is only between me and him? Because technically, you haven't chosen either one of them yet. So now I want to know something. If you gave this second person even the smallest opening right now, what would he actually do with it? 4 of Pentacles upright. Okay, that's interesting. Because this is someone who is still holding back, but very intentionally. Like he's not holding back because he doesn't want you. He's holding back because he doesn't want to make a move that he can't take back. And I think that's important. Because if you gave him an opening, I don't feel like he would immediately come out with some huge confession. I think he would test it first, very carefully. Maybe he'd text you more often. Maybe he starts finding little reasons to talk to you when the first person isn't around. Maybe he asks you something slightly more personal than he normally would. Something where, depending on how you answer, he can either keep going or pull it right back and pretend it was nothing. Do you know what I mean? The Four of Pentacles is cautious. It wants to know something is safe before it lets go. So I could see him giving you a compliment that's just a little different, or suggesting the two of you do something together, but making it sound casual enough that if you don't respond the way he hopes, he can say, "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it," but he did. I think that's the thing. There would be intention underneath it. He may even try to figure out where you stand with the first person without directly asking. Like, "Are you talking to anyone?" Or, "What's going on with you and him?" Something that gives him information without completely exposing himself. Because I think he needs one more piece of evidence. Not that he likes you. He already knows that. He needs evidence that he wouldn't be blowing up a friendship over something completely one-sided. But what's interesting about this card is, once he gets that evidence, I don't know how slow he stays, because this person has already spent so much time telling himself, "No, I can't have that." So if that suddenly changes to, "Wait, maybe I actually can," I feel like he could become much more decisive than the first person very quickly. And that's almost ironic. Because the guy who had the easier path toward you is the one sitting there assuming he has time, while the guy who thought he had no path at all may be the one preparing to actually create one. And I feel like it would only take one noticeable move from him. One text, one invitation, one moment where his interest becomes just obvious enough. Because if the first guy sees that, I think that Four of Wands comfort disappears really fast. And suddenly you could have both of them realizing at almost the exact same time, "I actually need to do something." Temperance reversed. Okay, yeah. That changes the energy, because Temperance upright would be someone who can stay calm, take their time, let everything unfold naturally. Reversed, I feel like that patience starts disappearing. And this is the first person. I think the second he realizes this other guy might actually make a move toward you, suddenly the whole "I have time" thing doesn't feel as comfortable anymore. Because now there's something he can't control. Before, he could assume you were available. He could assume the second person was going to respect whatever understanding existed between them. He could think about you, imagine being with you, maybe even talk about eventually doing something, without having to worry that the situation was changing. But if this second person starts texting you more, or spending more time with you, or if the first guy sees you responding to him differently, Temperance reversed feels like that gets under his skin. Not necessarily in some huge dramatic way, but I think you would notice a change. Maybe suddenly he's contacting you more. Maybe suddenly he wants to know what you're doing. Maybe plans that he kept putting off become, "So when are you free?" And there could even be a little jealousy here. Not necessarily something he admits, but something where he starts paying much closer attention to how you interact with this other person. Because I think he genuinely does like you. That hasn't changed. The problem was never that he didn't care. The problem was that he felt secure enough to move slowly. And sometimes you don't fully understand how valuable access to someone feels until that access stops feeling guaranteed. Do you know what I mean? Suddenly it's like, wait, she could actually choose somebody else, and I feel like that realization could make him much more obvious. But there's a problem with that too, because I think the second guy is going to notice the timing. He may look at this first person suddenly putting in effort and think, "So now you're doing something. Like now that I'm interested enough to stop hiding it, now you're ready." And instead of making the second guy back off, I actually think that could make him less willing to, because from his perspective, It might prove exactly what he was already thinking. That the first person was comfortable until somebody challenged that comfort. So now the tension becomes mutual. Neither one necessarily wants some huge conflict. But neither one wants to be the person who steps aside either. And that makes me want to look at something different. Because obviously both of these guys want you. But wanting you because someone else might get you, and actually being emotionally right for you, are two completely different things. So I want to see what each one of them would actually offer you. Because I have a feeling that comparison may not look exactly how you expect. 9 of Cups reversed. Okay. That's actually kind of interesting. Because I thought I was going to get one energy for each of them. But I almost feel like this card is showing me the difference between them by itself. Because the 9 of Cups is wish fulfillment. It's getting something you really want. But reversed. There can be this issue where what you think you want and what you're actually emotionally engaging with are not completely the same thing. And honestly, that feels more connected to the first person. Because I do think he wants you. I've said that from the beginning. But there's something about his connection to you that feels very based around the idea of you. Like, I could see us together. You would fit into my life. This could make me happy. Which is nice. But how much is he actually paying attention to where you are emotionally right now? Because I feel like he became so comfortable with the possibility of having you that he stopped studying the situation. Meanwhile, the second person has had to do the exact opposite. He couldn't assume anything. He couldn't just decide, eventually this is going to happen. So he's been watching. Not in a creepy way. I mean, he's been noticing you. How you respond to things. What makes you comfortable. What makes you pull back. What you remember. What you laugh at. Maybe even little things you've said that the first person forgot because he assumed he would have more time to learn them later. And that's where this gets complicated. Because the first person may offer more obvious stability. He may fit into your life more easily. There may be fewer consequences, fewer awkward conversations, less social mess around that connection. And there is something real about that. But the second person, I feel like there's more active attention, more curiosity, more of this feeling of, I actually want to know her. And obviously that comes with complications. Because choosing to explore something with him could affect this friendship or whatever connection exists between these two men, so neither one is automatically better. And you're also not some prize they're competing over. You still have to actually want one of these connections. But I think the surprising thing here is that the person who has been standing farther away from you may have quietly learned more about you. And now I want to know something else, because if both of these men realize you could genuinely choose the other one, which one is actually more afraid of that? And more importantly, what does that fear make him do? 5 of Swords upright. Okay, yeah, this feels like the breaking point. Because the 5 of Swords is tensioned, it's conflict. But more than that, it's someone reaching a point where they're asking themselves, what exactly am I protecting here? And I feel like that's the second person. Because I don't think his biggest fear is actually losing you to the first guy. I think his bigger fear is doing nothing and then watching you end up with somebody else, while knowing he never even gave you the option of choosing him. Do you know what I mean? Like, he could handle hearing, no, I don't feel that way about you. That would hurt, obviously. But I think what would bother him more is never finding out at all. Because then he's always left with, what if? And the 5 of Swords makes me feel like he's getting closer to deciding that avoiding conflict is not worth that. Especially if something happens that makes him feel like the first person still isn't going to act. Maybe you say something that makes it obvious you're frustrated. Maybe you stop giving the first guy as much attention. Maybe there's another one-on-one moment between you and this second person where the chemistry feels impossible to pretend isn't there. Maybe he directly asks the first guy, "So, are you actually going to do something?" And the answer is basically, "Not right now." I feel like that could be it. Because at that point, the second person may think, "Then why am I still staying out of this?" And meanwhile, I think the first person's fear is almost the opposite. His fear is realizing that what he thought was basically waiting for him was never actually his. He had possibility, he had access, he had time. But he didn't have possession, and I think he may have confused those things. So if the second person finally decides, "I've respected this long enough," that forces the first guy to confront something he's been avoiding. You can't keep claiming an opportunity you're refusing to take. And I don't know. The Five of Swords is complicated because nobody really walks away from this situation feeling completely comfortable. If the second guy makes a move, there could be tension. There could be awkwardness. There could be this feeling of, "You knew I liked her," but at the same time, you knew he liked you too. Or at least you're starting to know. And you still get to decide. So now I'm wondering, if he crosses that line, is he actually stealing an opportunity from the first person? Or is he just forcing everybody to finally acknowledge that this was always going to come down to who you choose? The Hanged Man upright, okay. That actually feels like the perfect card to end this on, because the Hanged Man is basically about a situation that cannot stay exactly the way it is forever. There's been this pause, this waiting, this feeling of nothing is technically happening yet. But that doesn't mean nothing has been changing. And I think that's what this whole situation has been. The first person has been sitting in that Four of Wands energy, thinking the potential between you is enough to keep the door open. The second person has been sitting back because he thought respecting the first guy meant he had to stay completely out of it. And you're kind of in the middle of this, without necessarily agreeing to either one of those assumptions. Do you know what I mean? Because neither one of them gets to decide for you that something is already claimed. And I think the Hanged Man is forcing that realization, especially for the second person. He has been holding himself in this suspended position, where he's basically saying, "I want her, but I'm not allowed to do anything about it." And I don't know how much longer he believes that, because eventually he has to ask himself, who exactly is benefiting from him staying stuck? Not you. Because maybe you would actually want to know. Not him, because he's sitting there suppressing something real. And honestly, maybe not even the first guy. Because this second person becoming a real possibilities may be the exact thing that forces the first person to stop treating you like something he can come back to whenever he's ready. That's what I find interesting about this. Even if you ultimately prefer the first person, the second person still changes the situation. Because suddenly the first guy has to show you what he actually intends to do. Not what he imagines. Not what he tells his friends. Not what he thinks could happen eventually. What is he actually willing to do? And the same thing goes for the second person. If he breaks this unspoken rule, then he has to accept that there may be consequences. He can't hide behind, "Well, I liked her quietly," anymore. He would actually have to risk something. So I don't think the Hanged Man is telling me that one specific outcome is guaranteed. I think it's saying the waiting itself is reaching a point where it stops making sense. Someone has to change their perspective. Someone has to move differently. And I really feel like the second person is getting closest to that point first, because he's starting to realize wanting you privately is not enough. And if either one of these men genuinely wants to have you in his life, eventually he's going to have to risk finding out whether you choose him too.